A billionaire tricked his maid into marriage, but her kindness made him question everything. Adrian Knight's world was one of precision and perfection. Every move he made, every decision he enacted, was calculated to ensure the continuation of his ruthless empire. He had built his wealth on control, on keeping everything and everyone around him in line. Business meetings were dominated by logic and strategy. His personal life was governed by the same principles. Emotions, to Adrian, were a weakness. The softness that others allowed into their hearts only made them vulnerable, and vulnerability was something Adrian could no longer afford. His heart had been broken too many times, his trust shattered in ways that could never be repaired. Past relationships had taught him that love was fleeting and cruel. It was an illusion, something that only led to heartache and disappointment. So, he had chosen to live without it, to build his world on cold, unyielding control. Though he had achieved great success, there was a void within him, a space he couldn't fill with business or power. The loss of someone close to him years ago had left a permanent scar, a reminder of the pain that came with loving and losing. That grief had shaped his view of relationships. He had decided, once and for all, that he would never let anyone into his heart again. Instead, he would secure what he needed when he needed it, and nothing more. And now, as the pressure to maintain his image reached its peak, he realized that a wife was no longer a luxury. She was a necessity. His advisors had emphasized the importance of a perfect public persona, one that included a well-mannered, supportive wife. Adrian had never cared for the opinions of others, but even he knew that without the right image, his empire could falter. He needed a woman who would play the part, someone who would accompany him to events and act as the perfect accessory to his life. But she couldn't just be any woman. She had to be obedient, manageable, and devoid of complexities that could disrupt the flawless world he had carefully constructed. Adrian's eyes eventually fell on Eleanor Stone, a maid in his mansion. At first, she had been just another face in the background, blending into the household without drawing attention to herself. But as Adrian observed her more closely, he saw the potential she held. Her humble background, her quiet obedience, her lack of ambition, all of it made her the perfect candidate for the role he needed her to play. She had no desire for fame, no secret agenda to undermine him. Eleanor was, in Adrian's eyes, a blank slate, someone he could mold to fit the life he envisioned. She had no idea what he was planning, but he knew he would offer her a life of luxury and stability. It would be a marriage of convenience, a partnership that would serve both of their needs. Eleanor, for her part, had always believed in the possibility of love, even after the heartbreaks she had suffered. She had come from modest beginnings and worked diligently in Adrian's mansion, never once expecting anything more than the routine of her duties. Her life was simple, and while it wasn't glamorous, it was predictable. Yet, beneath the surface, Eleanor longed for something more, a connection, a partnership that would allow her to experience love in a way she had only dreamed of. Though she had suffered from the pain of past relationships, she still carried a flicker of hope that perhaps, one day, someone would come to understand her and offer her the love she deserved. For now, Eleanor remained largely unaware of Adrian's growing interest in her. She worked tirelessly, keeping to herself and never seeking the attention of her wealthy employer. But Adrian's plans for her began to take shape. He saw the opportunity before him. A woman who, despite her quiet demeanor, could fit perfectly into the life he had so carefully constructed. He began to subtly manipulate her, planting the seed that marriage to him could be her ticket to a better life, one of stability, comfort, and luxury. Eleanor, always pragmatic and cautious, was hesitant at first. She couldn't understand why Adrian, a man who had always kept his distance, would suddenly be offering her such a proposition. What did he truly want from her? Was this a chance at a better life, or simply another arrangement that would come with its own set of sacrifices? Adrian, ever the strategist, wore her down with his charm and calculated logic. He spoke of the life she could have, one of comfort, respect, and security. He framed their marriage as a mutually beneficial arrangement, where she would provide him with the image of the perfect wife, while receiving everything she had ever wanted in return. The subtle persuasion worked. Despite her reservations, Eleanor began to believe that this might be the best chance she would ever get. Her longing for security, her need to escape the confines of her current life, pushed her to accept the proposal. Still, she didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation or the true nature of Adrian's motives. But she agreed, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this could lead to a better future. Their marriage, however, would be far from a fairy tale. It was a business decision, nothing more. Adrian treated the union with clinical detachment, never once allowing himself to entertain the possibility of love or connection. His focus remained solely on maintaining the perfect image, and Eleanor, though she hoped for something more, was unsure of what to expect. She entered the marriage with a sense of duty, but there was still a flicker of hope deep within her that perhaps, in time, Adrian might come to see her as more than just a tool in his carefully constructed world. Yet, as the days passed, Eleanor began to feel the weight of the emotional distance between them. Their home, though filled with luxury and comfort, felt empty and cold. She was an outsider in her own marriage, her hopes for love and connection slipping further away with each passing day. As the days turned into weeks, the emptiness of their marriage only grew. Adrian continued to maintain his cold, detached exterior, never once allowing any vulnerability to seep through. His every interaction with Eleanor was transactional, polite but impersonal. There was no warmth in his touch, no softness in his words. To him, she was nothing more than a fixture, fulfilling the role he had assigned her without complaint. In return, Eleanor struggled to navigate the silent chasm between them. She had entered the marriage with a sense of hope, believing that perhaps time would soften Adrian's heart, that he might see her as more than just an accessory. But every passing day seemed to push. She found herself questioning her decision, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The luxurious life Adrian had promised her felt hollow, like a gilded cage. She had expected more, at least a glimmer of emotional connection, of shared intimacy. But Adrian kept his distance, locked away in his world of control and perfection. She could feel the weight of his indifference pressing down on her, and it was suffocating. The quiet moments they shared, if they could even be called moments, were filled with nothing but silence. Adrian would disappear into his office for hours, and Eleanor would retreat into the emptiness of the mansion, her thoughts heavy with doubt. In her heart, Eleanor longed for something more. She wanted to be seen, truly seen, by the man she had married. But she had no idea how to bridge the gap between them. She could feel herself slipping further and further into the background of her own life, her desires and needs fading into the distance. The hope that had once fueled her decision to marry Adrian began to wither, replaced by a growing sense of resignation. She had wanted a life of love and connection, but instead, she had found herself trapped in a marriage of convenience, one where love was an afterthought, a luxury that neither she nor Adrian seemed to have room for. Adrian, on the other hand, was becoming more and more consumed by the life he had built for himself. The empire he had worked so hard to create demanded his attention, and his marriage, though necessary, was little more than an obligation. He had once believed that emotional detachment was the key to success, but now, as the days wore on, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. He had always kept people at arm's length, convinced that his need for control would keep him safe from the pain of vulnerability. But the more he interacted with Eleanor, the more he found himself questioning his beliefs. She was a constant presence in his life, and yet he couldn't seem to push her away completely. Her kindness, her quiet strength, had begun to chip away at the walls he had so carefully constructed. But that realization only made him more defensive. He wasn't ready to open himself up to her, not after all the hurt he had endured in the past. The emotional distance between them began to feel unbearable. Adrian knew he was failing as a husband, but he didn't know how to fix it. Every time he tried to reach out to Eleanor, to offer her something beyond his cold, calculated demeanor, he was met with resistance. Eleanor had withdrawn into herself, too hurt by his indifference to even attempt to connect. And so, they remained locked in a silent standoff. Two people bound by an arrangement, but emotionally worlds apart. As the tension between them continued to build, Adrian began to feel something he hadn't in years: guilt. He had never allowed himself to feel guilty for his actions before. He had always justified his decisions, convinced that they were necessary for his survival. But now, as he watched Eleanor retreat further into herself, he couldn't ignore the weight of his own failure. He had promised her a better life, a life of comfort and stability. Yet, all he had given her was emotional neglect. And as much as he tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that this was the way things had to be, he couldn't shake the truth. He was failing her. Eleanor, too, was becoming more aware of the growing emotional chasm between them. She had tried to push aside the pain of their disconnected marriage, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. Every day, she felt more like a shadow in Adrian's world, her presence barely acknowledged. She had hoped in the beginning that their marriage could evolve into something real, that Adrian would see her as more than just a means to an end. But now, the weight of his indifference was crushing her. She was beginning to question whether this marriage, this life, was even worth holding on to. How much longer could she endure the silence, the emotional distance? Was there even a chance that Adrian would ever come to see her as someone worthy of love? Or was she doomed to remain invisible in his eyes forever? The growing emotional strain between them reached a breaking point one night. Adrian returned home late, as he often did, to find Eleanor sitting alone in the living room. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of all the things they hadn't said to each other. Eleanor didn't even look up as he entered. She had grown used to the silence that defined their existence. But tonight, something felt different. Adrian stood still for a moment, watching her, as if unsure of what to do. The sharp ache of guilt gnawed at him, but he remained silent. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't think I can do this anymore, Adrian." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken pain. Adrian's chest tightened as he realized just how far they had drifted. The idea of losing her, of losing the one person who had ever shown him genuine kindness, was too much for him to bear. But he didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to reach her, to make her understand that he hadn't meant to hurt her. In that moment, as the silence stretched between them, Adrian knew that if he didn't change, he would lose her for good. The question was whether he was ready to let go of the control that had defined his life for so long in order to reach out to her, and whether she would even be willing to let him. Eleanor walked down the aisle, her steps measured, each one heavier than the last. The gown felt too tight around her chest, not because of its fit, but because of the weight pressing down on her heart. She had hoped at one point that the wedding would feel like the beginning of something real. But now, all she could feel was the cold emptiness of the entire affair. Adrian stood at the altar, as detached as ever, his expression one of cool composure. His eyes didn't soften when they met hers, and there was no hint of the affection she had secretly longed for. It was as if he was there to fulfill a necessary obligation, rather than to mark the union of two people. Her thoughts swirled with doubts, but she didn't voice them. She simply followed the path laid out before her. This wasn't a marriage built on love. It was a business arrangement, a transaction where emotions had no place. As the vows were exchanged, Eleanor felt like a mere accessory in the grand design of Adrian's life. Nothing more than a symbol of his carefully curated world. A world that lacked the warmth she had once dreamed of. Adrian, for his part, treated the ceremony with the same cold precision that defined everything in his life. He saw the event as nothing more than a formal step in securing his image, nothing more than another checkbox on a list of things that needed to be done. He had no illusions about what the marriage meant. It was a necessary arrangement to protect his public persona, a tool to keep his world intact. As he looked at Eleanor, standing there beside him, he felt no stirring of affection. There was no desire to bridge the emotional distance between them. He had no need for it. He had never been one to let emotions complicate things. The idea of love was a weakness, one that had caused him enough pain in the past to make him wary of ever allowing it into his life again. So he stood there, with his heart locked away behind walls built over years of heartbreak. Eleanor, standing beside him, was just another fixture in the life he had constructed, a life where nothing could disrupt the calm he had worked so hard to maintain. The wedding reception was a blur for Eleanor. The opulence of the venue, the laughter of the guests, the clinking of glasses. None of it reached her. She stood on the edge of the celebration, a silent observer to the life that now surrounded her. The luxury, the glamour, all of it felt hollow without the love and connection she had hoped would accompany it. The guests around her marveled at the perfection of the event, but to Eleanor, it was just another reminder of the cage she had entered. Despite the beautiful setting and the smiles on people's faces, she felt more isolated than ever. She had imagined that, in time, this marriage might evolve into something meaningful. But the distance between her and Adrian was already palpable, an invisible wall that neither of them seemed willing to tear down. As the evening wore on, Eleanor found herself retreating further into the background. Adrian was busy with the guests, his focus shifting between business associates and acquaintances, as if she were nothing more than a shadow in the corner of his life. She moved through the motions, smiling politely when necessary, but her mind was far from the festivities. She thought back to the moments before the ceremony, to the quiet whispers of doubt that had crept into her heart. Was this really the life she wanted? She had hoped that Adrian's coldness would soften in time, that perhaps the quiet companionship of marriage would lead them to something more. But now, standing amidst the glittering crowd, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. Adrian had never promised her love, only an escape from the life she had known. And while the promise of security and comfort had once seemed like enough, she now wondered whether it was worth sacrificing her own emotional well-being. Adrian, for his part, continued his usual routine, maintaining the control that was so ingrained in him. His days were meticulously planned, every minute accounted for. Even in the midst of his marriage, nothing had changed. He rose early, exercised, and spent hours in his office, overseeing the empire he had built. There was no room for spontaneity, no room for connection with Eleanor. His world, as perfect as it was, had no place for the messy unpredictability of emotions. And while he told himself this was the way it had to be, a nagging sense of dissatisfaction began to build in the pit of his stomach. The more he saw Eleanor, the more he realized that something was missing, something he couldn't define. She was there, a constant presence in his home, but she might as well have been invisible for all the attention he paid her. His emotional walls had kept her at bay, and as much as he liked to believe it was for the best deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. Eleanor, too, began to feel the weight of their disconnection. She moved through her days in the same mechanical way that Adrian did. She managed the house, prepared his meals, kept the mansion spotless. But it was all without purpose, without meaning. She wasn't really living in this house. She was simply existing. Adrian's indifference made her feel as though she had become nothing more than a servant, a silent shadow in the background of his life. She longed for more, but she knew better than to expect anything from him. The gap between them grew, and with each passing day, the realization that this marriage might never evolve into something more painful settled in. Despite her best efforts to remain hopeful, the truth was becoming clear. Adrian saw her only as an accessory, something to maintain the illusion of a perfect life. And yet, Eleanor continued to care for him. Despite his coldness, she couldn't help herself. It was in her nature to nurture, to look after those she cared for, even when they gave nothing back. She made him tea when he was tired, ensured that his favorite meals were on the table when he returned home late from work, and did her best to maintain a peaceful, calm atmosphere in the house. She didn't expect anything in return. She simply wanted to do her part, to make him feel comfortable, even if it was only for a moment. But as time passed, she began to feel a deep sense of frustration. Why was she doing all of this? Why did she continue to put in the effort, when it was clear that Adrian didn't even notice. It was as if her kindness, her love, didn't even exist in his world. She could see the way he looked at her sometimes. Curious, perplexed, but never with affection. He didn't understand why she did the things she did, and the lack of acknowledgement cut deeper than she was willing to admit. Adrian's inner turmoil began to intensify as he noticed the subtle ways Eleanor cared for him. At first, he hadn't given it much thought. Her gestures were small, unremarkable in the grand scheme of his structured life. She made him tea, brought him his preferred book when he was stressed, or quietly took care of his things without a word. But over time, these actions began to chip away at the wall he had so carefully constructed around his emotions. Why was she so kind to him? What did she want in return? He couldn't understand it. People only ever did things for him if they had an agenda, a need to be fulfilled. Eleanor, however, seemed to give freely, with no expectation. It was a behavior that confused him and, more troublingly, unsettled him. He couldn't ignore the fact that her selflessness, her warmth, was entirely alien to him. In all his years of building his empire, he had never encountered someone like her. She wasn't looking to control him or demand anything from him. She simply wanted to make his life easier, to bring a little comfort to the cold, unfeeling world he had created. It was a stark contrast to the transactional nature of his relationships with others, and the discomfort it stirred in him made him retreat further into himself. The vulnerability that Eleanor's kindness unearthed was terrifying. He wasn't ready to let go of the control he had so meticulously built. He didn't know how to handle the feelings she invoked in him, nor did he want to face the possibility that her acts of kindness might be the very thing he needed in order to heal from the scars of his past. Yet, the more Adrian retreated, the more Eleanor's quiet acts of care grew in intensity. She didn't demand his attention, didn't ask for anything in return, but her small gestures spoke volumes. She had a way of making the house feel like home, something Adrian hadn't known in years. Her smile, though rare, warmed the otherwise cold, sterile spaces of the mansion. But as much as he tried to shut it out, as much as he buried his emotions beneath the rigid control he had honed over a lifetime, Adrian couldn't deny the impact Eleanor was having on him. Her presence unsettled him in ways he had never imagined. The walls he had erected to protect himself from the world, from pain, were slowly crumbling under the weight of her goodness. But to acknowledge this would mean admitting vulnerability. Meanwhile, Eleanor's heart began to suffer. Her kindness, once a source of comfort for her, started to feel like a burden. She cared for Adrian without expectation, but the silence between them was suffocating. She was growing emotionally exhausted, torn between her feelings for him and the stark reality that he might never view her as anything more than a useful fixture in his life. She couldn't ignore the growing ache in her chest as she realized that all her acts of kindness, all her quiet attempts to reach him, were being met with indifference. Adrian's coldness was like a shadow that loomed over her, and the more she reached out, the further he seemed to retreat. She wondered if he even noticed the toll it was taking on her, whether he cared at all about the emotional strain she was enduring. Eleanor faced a quiet, internal battle. Could she continue giving him pieces of her heart, even if he never offered her any of his in return? Was her selflessness, her hope for something more, worth the constant rejection? Every time she offered him kindness, she found herself slipping further into emotional dependency. She feared losing herself, becoming someone who gave everything but received nothing in return. She couldn't shake the fear that she was setting herself up for heartbreak, but the thought of pulling away from Adrian, of giving up on the man she had begun to care for, felt unbearable. She was caught in a painful cycle of longing and emotional disconnect, and no matter how hard she tried to break free, she always found herself drawn back to him, to the hope that one day he might truly see her. Adrian, though, seemed entirely unaware of the emotional turmoil he was causing her. His focus remained fixed on his empire, his business, the world that he controlled with precision and strategy. To him, emotions were a weakness, a disruption to his well-ordered life. He saw Eleanor as an extension of his need for control, a figure who should simply fulfill her role without complicating things with feelings. But the more time he spent in her presence, the more he realized that his world, his perfectly constructed life, wasn't as complete as he had once believed. He couldn't ignore the fact that something was missing, something intangible that he couldn't quite name. He had never considered love to be part of the equation, but now, more than ever, he began to wonder if he had been wrong all along. Could Eleanor's kindness, her love, be the very thing he had been missing? The thought scared him. It meant acknowledging that he wasn't invincible, that he was capable of being vulnerable, of needing someone else. And that was a prospect he had never been willing to entertain. Despite this, Adrian's walls continued to crack. Though he didn't know how to process his feelings for Eleanor, there was no denying that he was being drawn to her. He found himself noticing things he hadn't before. How her eyes softened when she spoke, the way she moved through the house with a quiet grace, the gentle warmth that radiated from her. It wasn't love, not yet at least, but it was something more than indifference. It was the beginning of an emotional shift he wasn't prepared for, and it left him feeling disoriented and vulnerable. For Eleanor, the pain of loving someone who couldn't love her back was becoming unbearable. Every day, she continued to offer him her care, her affection, even as she felt herself slipping further away from her own emotional center. The role she had once thought she could play as a wife, as someone who would find fulfillment in this marriage, was quickly fading. She was no longer sure who she was in Adrian's life, if she was even a person to him at all. The emotional isolation she felt was suffocating, and the more she gave of herself, the more she began to lose herself. The cycle of hope and disappointment seemed never-ending, and each day left her wondering if she had made a mistake, if the price of her kindness was too high. Adrian had always prided himself on his ability to control everything in his life. The people around him, the business deals, the relationships. Everything was meticulously arranged to ensure that he remained in charge. But Eleanor, with her quiet grace and unwavering kindness, had begun to throw off his equilibrium. At first, he didn't pay much attention to the small things she did. She made him tea when he was stressed, remembering the precise way he liked it, and she offered words of encouragement when his mind felt overwhelmed. He hadn't asked for any of it, yet somehow there she was, always there with a smile and a gentle gesture. It seemed insignificant, perhaps even inconsequential, but it gnawed at him in ways he couldn't understand. Why did she care so much? What was the motivation behind these simple acts? He couldn't help but wonder, even as he buried his questions beneath the weight of his own resolve. It wasn't until one particularly grueling day that Adrian began to truly feel the weight of her kindness. He had been consumed by the pressure of his empire, burdened by the demands of his business and the ghosts of his past. The day had started like any other, but by the afternoon he found himself teetering on the edge of a breakdown. His mind raced with anxiety, and for the first time in years he felt out of control, consumed by a storm of emotions he couldn't navigate. Just when he thought he might crumble, Eleanor appeared beside him. Without hesitation, she stepped into his space, offering him not just comfort, but emotional support. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply sat with him, offering her presence, her quiet strength. Adrian didn't know how to react. He wasn't used to this kind of emotional support, especially not without strings attached. Her kindness felt so foreign to him, so untainted by expectation, that it left him reeling. For the first time in his life, he was confronted with an emotion he didn't know how to control: genuine care. It shook him to his core. As the days passed, Adrian found himself observing Eleanor with a new sense of awareness. Her gestures, once inconsequential to him, now seemed significant. He began to notice the small things she did for him. How she made sure he had his favorite meals prepared, how she kept their home running smoothly, how she offered him quiet words of encouragement when he seemed lost in his thoughts. She didn't ask for anything in return, didn't demand acknowledgement for her actions, and as much as he tried to dismiss it, a part of him began to recognize the sincerity of her kindness. It was a kind of love he had never known, a love that was pure and untainted by the need for control or reciprocation. This realization forced Adrian to confront a truth he had long buried. Maybe, just maybe, love wasn't something to be controlled. Maybe it wasn't a transaction. But this idea clashed violently with everything he had built his life around. Love was supposed to be a means to an end, a tool to achieve success, not an emotional vulnerability. The internal conflict that raged within him grew more intense with each passing day. Adrian began to feel an emotional pull toward Eleanor, something he had never allowed himself to feel for anyone before. The kindness, the warmth, the subtle ways she tried to reach him. Everything about her stirred something deep within him. But with that attraction came fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of letting down the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart. His past had taught him that love led to pain, that vulnerability was a weakness, and allowing someone it meant opening himself up to betrayal. These were truths he couldn't shake, and so, despite the growing connection he felt, he withdrew. He pushed Eleanor further away, refusing to acknowledge the bond that was slowly forming between them. The more she offered him her kindness, the more he recoiled, as if her warmth was something to be feared. He needed to maintain control, he always had, and the thought of letting go, of embracing the very thing that threatened to break him, terrified him. In his retreat, Adrian could not see the toll his actions were taking on Eleanor. She, too, felt the emotional distance growing between them. Sensing his discomfort, she made a decision to step back, to give him the space he seemed to crave. She stopped pressing him for attention, stopped trying to engage him emotionally. Instead, she focused on his needs, quietly sacrificing her own desires and emotions in the hope that it would ease his burden. But this sacrifice came at a cost. As Adrian withdrew, Eleanor began to suppress her own feelings. She convinced herself that the best way to be a good wife, the best way to maintain the semblance of peace in their marriage, was to stay silent, to comply with his unspoken demands. She no longer sought closeness, no longer hoped for emotional connection. She told herself that if she just endured, if she just kept giving without asking for anything in return, it would be enough. But inside, a quiet sadness began to settle. The woman she had once been, the one who had dared to dream of love and connection, was slipping away, replaced by a woman who kept her heart hidden beneath layers of silence and compliance. This emotional withdrawal on Eleanor's part only deepened the chasm between them. Adrian, though he had pushed her away, began to feel the sting of her absence. The house, once filled with the warmth of her presence, now felt hollow. He noticed the silence more, the lack of her gentle touch, the absence of her quiet care. He didn't want to admit it, but her withdrawal unsettled him. It was as if he was losing something precious, something he hadn't even realized he had until it was gone. The realization came slowly, creeping into his consciousness like a shadow. He had pushed her away, and in doing so, had driven the very person who had shown him kindness out of his reach. But what was he supposed to do? He couldn't allow himself to be vulnerable. He couldn't risk the pain that might come from opening his heart to her. So, he kept his distance, even as a part of him longed for the connection they had almost shared. Eleanor, on the other hand, struggled with her own growing doubts. The hope she had once held for their marriage, the belief that one day Adrian might return her feelings, was beginning to fade. She could see that her sacrifices, her quiet acts of love, weren't bringing them closer. Instead, they seemed to be pushing them further apart. She was left questioning whether her hope for a deeper connection had been in vain, whether her love for Adrian was destined to remain unrequited. Every day, she told herself that she would keep going, that she would continue to love him, but the pain of feeling invisible in the relationship began to weigh heavily on her. She was no longer sure if she could keep pretending that everything was fine, if she could keep giving her heart to a man who seemed incapable of seeing her for who she truly was. The cycle of confusion and longing grew more intense as the days passed. Adrian, lost in his own emotional turmoil, couldn't bring himself to acknowledge what was happening between them. He longed for Eleanor's kindness, but he couldn't bring himself to let her in. He was terrified of what it would mean to allow someone to truly see him, to truly love him. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward her. The growing sense that maybe, just maybe, she was the one person who could help him heal from the wounds he had buried for so long. He wanted to believe it was possible, but fear held him back. And as he struggled with his own internal battle, Eleanor quietly resigned herself to the fact that she might never be the one to break through his walls. The hope that had once burned so brightly in her heart began to dim, replaced by the painful reality that Adrian might never truly love her. As the days wore on, both Eleanor and Adrian found themselves trapped in a silent, unspoken struggle that seemed to have no resolution. For Adrian, the fear of vulnerability continued to loom large, keeping him at arm's length from Eleanor despite the pull he felt toward her. He couldn't ignore the growing need for her presence, but he couldn't allow himself to reach out either. The weight of his own emotional scars made it impossible for him to fully trust in the love that Eleanor so freely offered. His mind told him that love was a risk, a dangerous gamble that could leave him broken. So, he shut down, building his walls higher, reinforcing the barriers he had so carefully constructed around himself. But no matter how hard he tried to suppress it, the pull toward her only grew stronger, forcing him to confront feelings he had long buried. For Eleanor, the quiet resignation became a way of life. The weight of unrequited love began to feel heavier with each passing day. She continued to serve Adrian, to care for him in every way she could, but the emotional toll of her one-sided devotion began to wear her down. She had always prided herself on being a strong, self-sufficient woman, but as the distance between them grew, so did the gnawing emptiness inside her. She was giving everything she had to this marriage, but she was receiving nothing in return, not love, not affection, not even the simplest acknowledgement of her efforts. The silence between them became a constant companion, and the ache in her heart grew louder. Despite her best efforts to remain hopeful, Eleanor began to wonder whether she had made a mistake. She questioned the choices that had led her to this point, the decision to marry a man who was so emotionally distant, so unwilling to meet her halfway. She had hoped that time would bring them closer, that Adrian's icy exterior would melt under the warmth of her love. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, it became clear that her hope was becoming increasingly futile. She had sacrificed so much for this marriage, but the emotional connection she longed for was nowhere to be found. The weight of her own emotions became unbearable, and she found herself pulling back, creating distance between them. Emotional divide had grown too wide to cross, and she didn't know how to bridge the gap. She wanted to scream, to demand that Adrian acknowledge her pain, but she knew it would only push him further away. Instead, she chose silence, choosing to suffer in solitude rather than risk pushing him away even more. The pain of loving someone who could never return her feelings was almost too much to bear, and the burden of her own unrequited love began to erode the woman she had once been. She felt like a shell of herself, hollowed out by the emotional neglect and the constant strain of pretending that everything was fine. Meanwhile, Adrian's internal battle reached a breaking point. He could no longer deny the fact that his feelings for Eleanor had changed. He had been so focused on maintaining control, on keeping his emotions buried beneath layers of logic and reason, that he had failed to see how much he was hurting her. Every time he pushed her away, every time he retreated into himself, he felt a pang of regret, but it was quickly buried beneath his fear. He wanted to reach out to her, to let her know that he saw her, that he appreciated her. But the thought of allowing himself to be vulnerable was terrifying. His past had taught him that love was a weapon, something to be used to manipulate and control, not something to be given freely. And yet, in Eleanor's kindness, he saw something that was pure and untainted. But as the days passed, Adrian began to realize that his inability to express his emotions, his refusal to let Eleanor in, was only driving her further away. The silence between them had become unbearable. He saw the toll it was taking on her, the way she seemed to withdraw into herself, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. For the first time, He felt a sense of urgency. He wanted to do something, anything, to repair the rip between them, but he didn't know where to start. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He wanted to be the man she deserved, but he didn't know how to be that person. He had spent so long controlling every aspect of his life that he didn't know how to navigate the complexities of love and emotion. The walls he had built around himself were so high that he couldn't see over them, couldn't even begin to understand how to tear them down. As the tension between them continued to grow, so did the emotional turmoil. Adrian's struggle intensified as he tried to reconcile his growing feelings for Eleanor with the fear that had always kept him from allowing anyone to truly see him. He began to wonder if he was doomed to repeat the mistakes of his past, if he was forever bound to live a life of isolation, unable to connect with anyone on a meaningful level. The thought of losing Eleanor, of never being able to give her the love she so clearly deserved, terrified him. But at the same time, the idea of fully opening himself up to her was equally terrifying. He had spent so many years hiding behind his need for control that he didn't know how to let go. Eleanor, for her part, continued to bear the weight of her unspoken pain. The love she had for Adrian had become a silent burden, one that she carried alone. She had always been the kind of person who believed in the power of kindness, in the idea that love could heal even the deepest wounds. But as she looked at Adrian, so consumed by his own fears and emotional walls, she began to wonder if that was enough. Could kindness really bridge the chasm between them? Or was she simply wasting her time, trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed? As the emotional distance between them grew, so did their sense of isolation. Adrian's internal struggle was mirrored by Eleanor's quiet resignation. Both were trapped in a cycle of longing and confusion, unable to break free from the walls they had built around themselves. And yet, despite the distance, despite the emotional pain, there was a flicker of hope deep inside both of them, an unspoken belief that, somehow, something might change. But the question remained, could love truly flourish in such an environment, or were they both destined to remain trapped in their own emotional prisons forever? As the days bled into weeks and weeks into months, the emotional divide between Adrian and Eleanor seemed to grow wider, an ever-present chasm that neither could seem to bridge. Adrian, consumed by his fear of vulnerability, found himself in a constant battle with his growing feelings for Eleanor. Each small gesture of kindness from her only served to deepen the internal conflict he could no longer ignore. He had spent his life building walls of control, of logic, of emotional detachment, believing that love was something to be avoided, something that could ultimately hurt him. But Eleanor's pure and selfless love challenged everything he thought he knew. His attraction to her was undeniable, yet the thought of fully allowing her into his heart terrified him. He had never allowed anyone to truly see him, to understand the depths of his pain, his fears. But with Eleanor, it was different. She was kind, patient, and genuinely caring, and yet, the more she offered herself to him, the more he recoiled. He couldn't help but pull away, afraid of losing the control that had kept him safe for so long. He could see her pain, feel the weight of her unspoken sorrow, and yet he didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to fix himself. Eleanor, on the other hand, found herself sinking deeper into a quiet desperation. She had hoped that, in time, Adrian would come to understand her love, that he would eventually soften, let down his guard, and allow her in. But the more she gave of herself, the more distant he seemed. It was as though she was invisible to him, her efforts unnoticed, her love unreturned. The small acts of kindness that had once brought her some semblance of hope now felt like a bitter reminder of how little she meant to him. She had become resigned to the idea that she was nothing more than a convenience to Adrian, a dutiful wife who filled the role expected of her without complaint. Despite her best efforts to keep her emotions in check, Eleanor began to question the purpose of it all. Her love for Adrian had once felt like a beautiful promise, something she was willing to nurture and cherish. But as the days passed, that love began to feel like a weight, a burden she could no longer bear. The sacrifice she had made to be with him, to build a life with him, had drained her, leaving her emotionally empty. She no longer knew how much longer she could continue giving without receiving anything in return. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that she was content in her role as his wife, when every fiber of her being ached for something more. The more Eleanor withdrew, the more Adrian began to feel the absence of her presence. At first, he didn't recognize it. He was too caught up in his own emotional turmoil to see how much her silence affected him. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, he began to notice the change. There was a coldness in the air between them, a distance that had never been there before. He could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him, and for the first time, he realized that the control he had clung to for so long was no longer enough to shield him from the growing emptiness inside. But even as he recognized this, Adrian remained trapped in his own fears. He wanted to reach out to Eleanor, to tell her that he saw her, that he appreciated her, but the words wouldn't come. His mind screamed at him to push her away, to maintain his emotional distance, but his heart, for the first time in years, ached for something more. The realization that he might be falling for her terrified him. The thought of opening himself up to the possibility of love, of letting someone in, felt like stepping into the unknown. And so, Adrian remained where he was, caught in a loop of emotional confusion and self-imposed isolation. He couldn't escape the truth that was slowly creeping into his consciousness, that he was afraid of love, afraid of being hurt, but more than that, afraid of losing the person who had shown him something he thought he'd never have. He was terrified that if he allowed himself to feel for Eleanor, he would only end up losing her in the end. Eleanor, too, was trapped in her own cycle of longing and resignation. She could see Adrian's internal struggle, the way he recoiled from her kindness, the way he built walls around himself whenever she tried to get too close. She knew that he was afraid, knew that he didn't trust easily, but that didn't make the pain of being shut out any easier to bear. Every day, she hoped that things would change, that Adrian would see her for who she truly was, that she wasn't just a wife, a role to be filled, but a woman with her own emotions, her own needs. But as time went on, Eleanor's hope began to fade. She could no longer keep pretending that everything was fine, that she could continue to give without ever receiving. As their marriage continued to wither under the weight of unspoken emotions, both Adrian and Eleanor found themselves at a crossroads. Adrian, though he feared it, was beginning to understand the depth of his feelings for Eleanor. For the first time, he saw her kindness for what it was, not a transaction, not something she was obligated to do, but an expression of pure love. He began to realize that the love he had always feared might actually be the one thing that could set him free. But that realization came with its own set of challenges. If he allowed himself to love Eleanor, would he be able to protect her, to be the man she needed? Or would he lose her, as he had lost so many others before? For Eleanor, the question was no longer about waiting for Adrian to change, to become the man she had hoped for. It had become a question of whether she could continue living in a marriage where love was a one-sided affair. The sacrifice she had made for him had not led to the connection she had yearned for, and she was beginning to wonder if it was time to let go. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when her heart was breaking. The pain of unrequited love was more than she could bear, and yet, the thought of giving up on Adrian was a wound in itself. As the emotional tension between them reached its peak, both Adrian and Eleanor found themselves standing on the precipice of something unknown. Would they continue down the path of isolation, or would they finally find the courage to confront their fears and the love that had always been right in front of them? Only time would tell whether they could break free from the prison of their own making, or whether they would remain trapped in a marriage that, despite the passion that simmered beneath the surface, seemed destined for failure. Adrian had never felt so lost. The weight of his emotions was suffocating, and the pressure to keep it all together was mounting. His internal turmoil had been building for days, his thoughts consumed by Eleanor's unwavering kindness, her selfless love that seemed to tear away at the very core of his carefully constructed defenses. Every little gesture she made, every cup of tea, every word of encouragement, felt like a blow to his pride, a reminder that he had never truly allowed himself to be vulnerable. The fear he had carried for so long had transformed into a tangled knot of frustration, self-doubt, and anger. His inability to accept her kindness and his constant battle against the vulnerability it exposed had pushed him to a breaking point. Then one evening, the pressure broke. The weight of everything, the past, the hurt, the confusion, came spilling out of him in a torrent of emotion. In a moment of overwhelming stress, he exploded, his words sharp and venomous. He accused Eleanor of manipulating him with her kindness, questioning why she continued to care for him when he had done nothing but remain cold and distant. The harshness of his words felt like a raw wound, deep and unforgiving, and as soon as they left his mouth, he knew he had crossed a line. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Eleanor stood there, completely stunned, her face a mixture of disbelief and pain. She couldn't understand it. How could he think that her kindness, her love, was anything other than genuine? She had never once expected anything in return, had never once tried to manipulate him. Everything she had done for him, every act of care and consideration, had come from a place of pure affection. And yet, here he was, accusing her of something so cruel, something she couldn't have possibly fathomed. The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment, she could do nothing but retreat into herself. The hurt was so deep, so raw, that she felt as though her very soul was being torn apart. She retreated, not just physically, but emotionally as well. She pulled away from him in a way that made her feel like a stranger in her own home, unsure of who she was or where she stood anymore. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Adrian watched her withdraw, feeling a deep, gnawing emptiness settle in his chest. As she turned away, her face a mask of pain and disbelief. Something inside him cracked. The very image of her, so hurt by his words, began to haunt him, gnawing at his conscience. He had never meant to cause her this much pain, but in his moment of weakness, he had lashed out, his insecurities driving him to say things he didn't mean. But even as the guilt began to sink in, he couldn't bring himself to reach out to her. The walls he had built around himself were still too high, too fortified, and he couldn't find the strength to tear them down. Instead, he stood there, frozen in place, unable to offer her the comfort she so clearly needed. Eleanor, for her part, silently suffered in the aftermath. The pain of his words lingered long after the confrontation, an ache that seemed to grow with each passing hour. She had always believed in the possibility of their love, always hoped that one day he would see her for who she truly was, a woman who loved him deeply and without condition. But in that moment, all of that hope seemed to shatter. She couldn't fathom how her love, which had always been so pure, could be mistaken for manipulation. It made her question everything, her choices, her beliefs, and the very nature of their marriage. She had given so much of herself. And for what? To be accused of something so unthinkable? The realization that she might never truly reach him, that her love might never be enough to break through his walls, weighed heavily on. Adrian spent the rest of the evening in a state of restless turmoil, guilt gnawing at him in waves. He couldn't shake the image of Eleanor's face, the pain that had been etched across her features. His anger had been a facade, a defense mechanism that he had clung to for so long, but in the end, it only hurt the one person who had never given up on him. As the hours stretched on, Adrian began to reflect on his past, on the relationships that had shaped his fear of vulnerability and his need for control. He thought of the betrayal, the abandonment, the hurt that had driven him to build the walls that had kept him safe. But now, in the quiet of his own mind, he could see the truth. Those walls were the very thing that had kept him from experiencing the love he craved. He had pushed away the one person who had consistently shown him kindness and selflessness, and now he could feel the weight of that mistake like a crushing burden. The guilt was overwhelming. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's face, saw the pain in her eyes, and it broke him. For the first time in his life, Adrian realized that he had been wrong, not just about Eleanor, but about love itself. Love wasn't a weakness. It wasn't something to be feared. It was a very thing that could heal him, if only he would let it. But instead, he had pushed it away, kept it at arm's length, afraid of the vulnerability it would bring. The reality of his actions hit him with a staggering force. He had hurt the one person who had never asked for anything from him, who had only given. And now, he had to face the truth. He had to change. He had to let go of his fear, let go of his pride, and allow himself to be vulnerable for the first time in his life. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. As the guilt continued to eat away at him, Adrian realized that the only way forward was to take responsibility for his actions. He couldn't keep hiding behind his walls, couldn't keep running from the one thing that could heal him. He had to apologize, had to try to make amends. But as he prepared to take that first step, the weight of his pride held him back. His ego resisted the idea of admitting that he had been wrong, of showing Eleanor just how deeply he had hurt her. But as the hours passed and the realization of his mistakes sank in, Adrian knew he had no other choice. He had to act. He had to fight for her, for their love, before it was too late. The weight of Adrian's decisions hung heavy over him as he stood at the crossroads of change. Each thought, each passing minute, seemed to draw him closer to the moment he would have to face the full extent of his mistakes. The idea of truly confronting Eleanor terrified him. But the fear of losing her forever was even worse. His guilt, once a quiet whisper, now screamed in his ears, urging him to take action. But how could he make things right? Could an apology truly repair the damage he had done? Adrian felt a deep sense of shame, but beneath it, there was also a flicker of hope, a desire to change, to show Eleanor that he could be the man she deserved. But as he steeled himself to take that first step, he couldn't help but wonder if Eleanor would even believe him. He had pushed her away so many times, built up so many walls, that the thought of her ever truly forgiving him seemed almost impossible. He feared that her heart might have already closed off, that she had given up on him. And the thought of facing her only to see the resignation in her eyes was a pain he wasn't sure he could endure. Yet, despite this fear, something inside him refused to let go. He had been given a glimpse of something beautiful, something pure, and he was unwilling to lose it without a fight. Meanwhile, Eleanor grappled with her own internal turmoil. The confrontation with Adrian had left her emotionally bruised, her heart aching from the sting of his words. But more than that, it left her questioning the very foundation of their relationship. She had always believed in the possibility of change, in the hope that Adrian could one day see the love she had for him. Yet now, she wasn't so sure. She had given so much of herself, and for what? To be accused of manipulation? To be rejected when she had only wanted to love him? As the days passed in silence, Eleanor's heart ached with the longing for the man she had once known, the man she believed was capable of love. But with each passing day, she felt herself growing more distant from him. The quiet despair that had begun to settle in her heart slowly grew louder, filling her with doubt. Was it worth holding on to hope when all she had received in return was emotional distance and pain? She loved Adrian, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that love alone might not be enough to heal the wounds of their fractured marriage. There had to be something more, something beyond the pain, beyond the hurt. But what? Despite everything, there was still a part of her that clung to the hope that Adrian might one day realize the mistake he had made, that he might finally open his heart to her in the way she had always longed for. But even as she held on to this fragile hope, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that her dreams of a future with him were slipping further and further out of reach. She had always been the one to give, always the one to put others first. But now, she found herself questioning whether it was enough. Was it possible to keep loving someone who didn't seem to want her love in return? The tension between them grew palpable, each moment spent in silence only deepening the emotional divide. Adrian, on one hand, was consumed by guilt, driven by the desire to make things right. But his pride, his fear, kept him at a distance. Eleanor, on the other hand, was torn between holding on to the hope that Adrian could change and accepting the painful reality that perhaps their marriage was beyond repair. She had never imagined that love could hurt this much, that the very person she had trusted with her heart could be the one to cause her the most pain. Adrian knew that he had to make a decision. He couldn't keep living in the limbo of indecision, caught between his fears and his desire for change. The walls he had built around himself were no longer serving him. They were suffocating him, and they were suffocating his chance at happiness with Eleanor. He had to let go. He had to let go of his need for control, his need to guard his heart, and allow himself to feel the full spectrum of emotions that came with love. But was he brave enough to take that step? Was he willing to risk everything for a love that he had once rejected? As the moment of truth approached, both Adrian and Eleanor were left standing on the precipice of change, each facing the unknown with a mixture of fear and hope. Adrian, torn between his desire to make things right and his fear of vulnerability, prepared to act. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained silently uncertain, wondering if the man she once loved could still be the man he had the potential to become. The air between them crackled with tension, a quiet storm brewing in the silence of their shared space. Neither knew exactly what the future held, but both knew that something had to change. And so, the stage was set for a confrontation that could either mend the rip between them or drive them even further apart. For Adrian, the path to redemption seemed steep and uncertain, but the thought of losing Eleanor forever made him willing to try. For Eleanor, the path was equally uncertain, torn between the love she had always given and the realization that it might never be enough to heal the wounds of their past. The journey ahead would require them both to confront their fears, their pride, and their past mistakes. But whether or not they could find their way back to each other, only time would tell. Adrian had spent days reflecting on his actions, the walls he had built around himself, and the damage he had caused. Each passing hour only deepened his regret, the weight of it pressing down on him with an intensity he could no longer ignore. The realization that he had pushed away the one person who truly cared for him felt unbearable. Eleanor had been his constant, offering him kindness and love in ways he had never known, and yet he had misunderstood her every gesture, misinterpreting her selflessness as manipulation. Now, as he stood on the brink of trying to fix the fractured bond between them, he knew he had to face his fears. His fear of vulnerability, his fear of loving and being loved. He had to let go of the control he had clung to for so long, the control that had been his shield against the world but had ultimately left him isolated and alone. When he finally approached Eleanor, it wasn't with the guarded, calculated words he had used in the past. There was no defensiveness, no manipulation, just raw honesty. He admitted to her and to himself that he had been afraid of love, afraid of the pain it could bring, and afraid of letting anyone close enough to hurt him again. His need for control had nearly destroyed everything he held dear, and he could no longer deny that. He told Eleanor that her kindness, her unwavering support, had been the only thing in his life that had never been tainted by ulterior motives. Her love had been pure, and he had wronged her by doubting it. It was in that moment, stripped of all pretenses, that Adrian offered his deepest apology. It wasn't just for the words he had spoken, or for the emotional walls he had built, but for the hurt and distance he had caused. He was broken, vulnerable, and filled with a desperate hope that she might still see something worth saving in him. Eleanor, for her part, was still carrying the weight of his earlier rejection. She had been wounded deeply by his accusations and emotional distance, and forgiving him was not a simple matter. She had given so much of herself to their relationship, only to find herself rejected when she had needed him most. But as Adrian spoke, his words were laced with a sincerity that she could no longer deny. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the truth in his voice, and she realized that he was no longer the man who had pushed her away so mercilessly. In that moment, something inside her shifted. Despite the pain, despite the scars his actions had left on her heart, she saw the man she had always hoped he could be, the man capable of change. It wasn't easy for Eleanor to forgive him. The scars of his harsh words ran deep, and she knew that trust would take time to rebuild. But she also understood that love was not about perfection. It was about accepting each other's flaws and growing together. She thought back to the moments when she had been vulnerable with him, when she had given him everything she had without expecting anything in return, and she realized that forgiveness wasn't just for Adrian. It was for herself, too. It was a chance to release the weight of the past and open herself up to the possibility of a better future. With that decision, a quiet but powerful shift occurred. They began to communicate more openly, their words no longer guarded by fear or anger. Adrian worked tirelessly to prove to Eleanor that he was committed to change. His actions spoke louder than his words ever could, and he showed her, day by day, that he was willing to earn her trust once more. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now he understood that control had no place in a relationship based on love and mutual respect. He had to let go of his old ways, to trust Eleanor and trust the process of rebuilding what they had broken. In time, they learned to embrace the messiness of love. It was not always perfect, nor did it come without its struggles, but it was real. They learned to accept each other's imperfections and to find beauty in the quiet moments, the simple acts of kindness, the words of encouragement, the shared laughter. They stopped trying to force their relationship into a mold and instead allowed it to unfold naturally, growing stronger as they learned from their mistakes and supported each other through the challenges life threw their way. As the days passed, Adrian and Eleanor began to build a life together that was no longer defined by past hurts or emotional distance. They created a relationship grounded in honesty, emotional intimacy, and a deep understanding of one another's needs. Adrian no longer felt the need to control, and Eleanor no longer felt the burden of carrying the relationship on her own. They were partners, equals in the truest sense of the word. They no longer had to fight for love. They simply had to nurture it, cherish it, and let it grow. Looking toward the future, both Adrian and Eleanor felt a renewed sense of hope. They knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, but they were ready to face it together. The love they shared had been tested, but it had also been strengthened by their commitment to each other. They were no longer afraid to be vulnerable, to love deeply, and to trust that they could build something beautiful together. Their bond was not perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. With each passing day, they grew closer, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. And in that certainty, they found peace, a peace that had once seemed impossible, but was now the foundation of their love.